The olive groves shimmered silver in the soft Thessalian breeze, but it was the vines that held the attention of old Felon that year. He was a farmer of unremarkable reputation, widowed, hunched, and unnoticed, living just beyond the shadow of Mount Othrys. His neighbors neither disliked him nor liked him particularly. His chief characteristic, by all accounts, was persistence. He harvested late, sowed early, and most notably always walked, for miles, barefoot. This story begins with one such walk. The sun had not yet broken over the horizon when Felon set out from his stone hut with a woven basket in one hand and a long wooden staff in the other. His destination was a vineyard he did not own, a piece of sloping earth leased from a cousin who lived 3 towns over. Vineyards, you see, were taxed inconsistently depending on the year and the mood of local magistrates. Felon had mastered the timing of planting not through astrology, but through bureaucratic delay. In this valley, where myths lay beneath every rock and spring, Dionysus was worshipped with quiet indifference. His shrine was not elaborate, a wooden statue with faded paint, 2 amphorae cracked from winter frost, and an altar permanently stained with the sediment of long-dried wine. No priest tended to it, but an offering or two might still appear after harvest. The villagers knew the rites, but had grown weary of wine gods and their parties. Yet it was here, near this forgotten shrine, that the event unfolded. The burden of grapes. That year had been generous. Vines heavy with swollen fruit bent under their own weight, and Felon found himself grateful for the shade. But abundance is its own problem. With more grapes than hands and more tasks than hours, the question became one of transport. His cousin, now mysteriously unavailable, had promised a donkey for harvest season. But the animal, like many promises, had disappeared with no forwarding address. This was not unusual. Donkeys were traded, stolen, or sacrificed depending on local need. They could be lent to gods, taken by gods, or eaten by desperate townsfolk. Felon was no stranger to disappointment. He tied the cloth of his tunic tight across his waist, filled his first basket, and began the long trek home. It was the 4th such trip that day when the world shifted. Or more accurately, the wind changed. He would later describe it to his neighbor, who immediately forgot as a breath with the scent of fermentation. The air was heavy, slightly floral, but unmistakably tinged with the smell of crushed grapes and wild thyme. It was the donkey that came first. A small, squat creature, eyes blinking slowly, approached him from the tree line. It had a faint marking on its flank resembling the vines etched on local pottery. No bridle, no saddle, no note. It stood quietly beside Felon and lowered itself to the ground. The donkey that knelt. Felon had no claim to magical interpretation, but he was a practical man. If a donkey appears in the middle of harvest season and invites itself to bear a burden, it would be foolish if not irreligious to reject the offer. He loaded the baskets gently, whispered a thanks to no one in particular, and walked beside it. The donkey followed with unnatural grace. It did not stumble on loose stones or bray at passing insects. Villagers noticed but said nothing. These were superstitious times, but also times of hunger. No one interrupts a man with grapes. This continued for 3 days. At dawn, the donkey would appear. By dusk, it would vanish. It never drank water, ate hay, or defecated, an unsettling absence in any beast of burden. Still, Felon's vineyard cleared before the rain came, and he offered 2 amphorae at the shrine. But it wasn't the wine that got Dionysus's attention. It was the meticulous way the baskets had been tied. Sacred logistics. Among the lesser-known aspects of Dionysian worship is the god's appreciation for symmetry. Unlike his brother Apollo, whose preferences leaned toward golden ratios and harmonious chords, Dionysus admired chaos given form, disorder tamed through human stubbornness. Felon had a peculiar method. He looped the baskets twice with braided rope, then crossed them with a figure-8 knot, finishing with a reef tie, which was uncommon in that part of Greece. His knots were functional, ugly, and unmistakably his. According to one obscure Orphic hymn, fragments of which were found centuries later near the base of Mount Oda, Dionysus once traveled with a mortal named Phelios, a man so boring and consistent that even madness could not dislodge his discipline. Some scholars argue this was a garbled memory of Phelon. Others suggest the name was symbolic of order amid intoxication. What we know is this. Shortly after the harvest, the shrine received a fresh statue, larger, marble, commissioned from a city sculptor who reportedly had never been to the village. The inscription at the base was simple, "To he who tied well." Locals interpreted it as a joke. Phelon didn't speak of it, but he stopped walking. The donkey, after all, had remained. Of all the gods, why Dionysus? One would assume that Athena, goddess of crafts and wisdom, or Demeter, patron of agriculture, might be more appropriate benefactors for a man like Phelon. But Dionysus is not only the god of wine and revelry. He is also the god of boundaries being crossed, of roles reversed, of mortal and divine blending into foggy evenings and misplaced sandals. In the ancient Greek worldview, divinity did not always come through heroism or virtue. Sometimes it arrived through timing, silence, and the unnoticed repetition of honest labor. The donkey, too, had a long and subtle history in Dionysian cult practice. While the bull and panther feature prominently in visual depictions, the donkey often served backstage roles bearing wine, carrying actors, or representing comic reversal in rural plays. In fact, in one rural mystery rite, the donkey was believed to have carried Dionysus himself while disguised as a peasant. This detail is often left out of the grand myths. But perhaps it explains why, when asked in later years why the statue had been erected, the village priest, a man who did not exist before that year, simply replied, "He lent it. It came back. So we said thank you." And what happened to the donkey? That's a longer part of the tale. But it begins with a question. Did Phelon ever ask who it belonged to? The seasons changed slowly in Thessaly, with autumn creeping in like a servant too polite to disturb the day. The vineyards browned, the grape leaves crisped, and Phelon, who had completed his harvest, found himself with a companion he had not sought but could no longer ignore. The donkey, ever punctual, continued to arrive each morning. But now there was no labor left. No baskets to carry, no vineyard to strip. It would stand by the old farmer's hut, chew nothing, and wait. Phelon, uncomfortable with idleness, began to invent errands, fetching clay from the dry stream bed, collecting moss for amphora padding, walking circles around his own property lines just so the creature would have something to follow. Neighbors began to murmur. Whispers are a kind of currency in rural life, and they spent it freely. Maybe it's a spirit. Maybe he found it and won't give it back. Maybe it's possessed. Or worse, maybe it's a gift. In ancient Greece, a gift from a god was rarely just a gift. It was a transaction, sometimes a test, always a complication. Bureaucratic piety. To understand what happened next, one must detour briefly into the world of rural temple administration. Most imagine Greek religion as grand temples, processions, and oracles speaking in riddles. But beneath that glittering surface was a vast, tedious bureaucracy. Sacred inventories, tribute tallies, and livestock registries filled the dusty rooms of minor temples across the land. And one rule was remarkably consistent. If a god lends you something, someone must eventually write it down. So it was that Phelon received a visitor. She arrived not in grandeur but with a cracked tablet and a stylus so worn its point had to be re-wetted after every letter. Her name was Eurymal, scribe of minor religious observances, on loan from the port city of Halos. She did not smile, she did not greet him. She squinted at the donkey, then at her tablet, and then at Phelon. "Have you filed a charisteria?" she asked. Phelon, who had not encountered this term, shook his head slowly. "A thank-offering registry," she clarified, as if that made it better. When he remained confused, She sighed and sat on a flat rock, producing a roll of instructions written in a script so fine it resembled thread. She explained that offerings must be recorded, statues justified, and divine loans documented lest they become claims. According to Temple Recordkeeping Directive Delta 4-37, Section III, Subclause Beta, any beast of burden provided by a known or suspected deity must be entered into local temple inventory within 2 moon cycles, or its use shall be deemed theft. Felon scratched his head and asked the most reasonable question in the entire story. Which god do I return it to? The cult inspectorate. Eurymal wasn't certain. The donkey bore no branding, no collar, and though she noted this with a slight grimace, no aura of sanctity beyond its persistent silence. She suspected Dionysus, of course. His cults were infamous for irregular behavior and inconsistent record-keeping, but her mandate required more than suspicion. A visit to the shrine yielded little. The new statue, while impressive, bore no formal dedication. The villagers had chipped in for it, believing it polite, but no one had documented the act and no priest had signed off. It was, as she reluctantly admitted, improperly consecrated public sculpture. This made the matter legally delicate. She decided to stay. For the next fortnight, the donkey became the subject of a full investigation. Eurymal filed inquiries to the regional cult networks. She asked witnesses to submit memory declarations. One poor shepherd was made to repeat the exact phrasing of his observation. It came down from the trees. I thought it was a normal donkey, but it didn't smell right. Donkeys in general do not carry odor of divinity, but Felon's donkey had an absence of smell that was, according to testimony, suspiciously neutral. A representative from the local Dionysian community, a potter named Cleeks, arrived to argue the matter. He declared the donkey was indeed Dionysian property, on loan under an unspoken understanding. Eurymal demanded he produce the shrine's inventory scroll. He said it had been eaten by goats. She fined him 3 drachmae and continued her investigation. What the donkey did not do. Perhaps the most remarkable thing is this: the donkey did not act. It didn't bray. It didn't bolt. It didn't break any cart or defecate on temple grounds. It didn't mate. It simply waited. That silence, that absence of will, was precisely what made it unnerving. In mythology, divine beasts are marked by extravagance: talking horses, winged bulls, serpents that breathe fire. But this donkey, if divine, seemed to have taken the opposite approach. It avoided distinction. And that, to Eurymal, was the most dangerous kind of sanctity. Divine inaction forces mortals to interpret. Negotiations of ownership. Eventually, the local Deme Council was convened. A decision had to be made. A donkey could not legally remain unclaimed in a jurisdiction with temple obligations, especially not one suspected of supernatural origin. Felon argued he did not own the donkey, but simply accepted its help. Cleeks, the potter, insisted it should be returned to Dionysus's shrine. Eurymal, bound by the laws of divine property, said it must either be returned to its source or donated to temple use with a signed acknowledgement of intent. No one could sign for Dionysus. So they compromised, in the way small governments often do. They issued the donkey a temporary sacred status, classifying it as unclaimed divine adjunct property. This meant it could remain with Felon, provided he submitted monthly logs, abstained from selling or breeding the animal, and allowed temple officials to inspect it quarterly. The donkey, who had no comment, was formally stamped with a clay seal tied to its left foreleg. Thus was born the strangest category in Thessalian inventory law: sanctified beasts on private homestead loan. What did Felon think? Felon never claimed to understand any of it. In the only record of his own voice, inscribed clumsily by a traveling epigrapher, he stated, "I walked, then the donkey came, I tied the baskets, the grapes did not rot, I said thank you." To him, the divine was not in the donkey itself, but in the timing, the relief from labor, the silent partnership. He never spoke much after the council decision. He fed the donkey with barley mash when it appeared. He scratched behind its ears. He continued to walk, just with less to carry. And then, one morning, it was gone. Not stolen, not lost. There were no tracks, no broken tether, no sign of struggle. The seal, however, was left behind, hanging neatly on the post beside Felon's door. Uriel filed the disappearance under untraceable return to divine origin, a rarely used clause in sacred property loss documentation. Cleeks, ever the opportunist, used the event to host a small Dionysian festival. He rebranded his pottery with donkey motifs and sold amphorae under the name Donkey of the Vines. Felon, now without his helper, continued his quiet labor, but something had shifted. He had become, against his wishes, a person with a story. And in ancient Greece, that was a heavy thing to carry. Echoes in the archive. Centuries later, a broken tablet was found in a provincial archive near Thermopylae. It was mostly unreadable, but two clear lines survived. Donkey Lent under informal divine terms. Man accepted without question, order preserved. Scholars still debate what it means. But the larger question remains. Was the donkey ever real? Or was Felon simply the kind of man gods entrust with boring miracles? Years passed, the donkey never returned. At first there were sightings, half-serious reports of a gray blur behind hedges, a hooved shadow in the vineyards at dusk. But they dwindled, like all rumors born of curiosity rather than conviction. People moved on. Harvests came and went. Felon aged. And the shrine changed. The modest wooden figure of Dionysus, once chipped and forgotten, had given way to marble. Then another offering appeared, a new basin carved from local stone. Eventually, an inscription was etched along the shrine's base, not by Felon, but by order of the local deme magistrate. He who carries may also be carried. It was a cryptic dedication. Some thought it referred to Dionysus himself, who was once carried in the arms of mortals while fleeing Hera. Others whispered it was a tribute to the donkey, or perhaps to Felon, though he never acknowledged it. But if you were to visit the village in those years, you would have found one remarkable change. The shrine had acquired a ledger. A real one, sealed against the weather, made of waxed wood and inscribed with the following title: Registry of Unclaimed Divine Assistance. The registry and the routine. Maintained first by Uriel and later by her apprentice, this ledger recorded every inexplicable, mildly helpful event experienced by locals. It wasn't dramatic. No prophecies, no visions, just assistance. My wheel did not break. A spring returned to life near my hut. The amphora did not crack during transport. At first these entries were mocked, but as years passed, the act of writing them became a kind of ritual, quiet and anonymous, a record of the unnoticed. And in that way it honored Felon's experience, miraculous not in spectacle but in its profound normalcy. By the time Felon turned 70, the registry was over 100 pages long. He had never contributed to it. The final harvest. It was a dry year. The grapevines withered early and the village feared a poor yield. Felon, now moving more slowly, worked the fields with help from two young cousins who had come to assist. They were practical boys, more interested in fig trees and coastal trade than myths. But they followed him into the rows, copied his knots, and mimicked the peculiar figure-eight tie he had always used for baskets. One morning, after tying the final load for transport, one cousin asked the question that hung unspoken for years. Did you ever know where the donkey came from? Felon sat down on an overturned Pythos jar and wiped his brow. He considered. Then he told them a story not about a god or a gift, but about balance, about how some burdens can't be lifted unless someone or something is willing to share them, even silently. He told them about the harvests before the donkey, when he would walk barefoot and bleeding through the vineyards, about the nights he slept on stone because the grapes couldn't wait, and about the year the donkey appeared, when everything simply worked. The cousins didn't interrupt. When he finished, one asked, "Did the donkey help again after the harvest?" Felon smiled. "It didn't need to. Death without drama. He died the following winter, not in some divine storm or ethereal disappearance, just quietly, in sleep, in the same stone hut he'd lived in for 5 decades. The cousins took care of the burial. He was laid beneath a cypress tree near the edge of the vineyard. No coins for Karen were placed on his eyes. Instead, they tied a figure-8 knot into a length of rope and hung it from the tree above. In the village, a small ceremony was held. Cleeks the potter donated a wine jug painted with a donkey motif. Urimel's apprentice read a passage from the ledger. "Let no man be forgotten for tying things well." The shrine, for the first time in recorded memory, received offerings in Felon's name. Not many: a bundle of reeds, a loaf of stale bread, a half-filled amphora. But one admitted, who left a single donkey hoofprint pressed into a tile of soft clay. It was baked and placed on the shrine wall. A boring legacy. Felon's life was not immortalized in epic poems. No dramatist wrote a tragedy of his days. The only surviving document bearing his name is a bureaucratic note from Urimel. Subject has demonstrated consistent, lawful use of divine adjunct property. No further infractions observed. Recommend closure of file. And yet, 200 years later, a student in the city of Larissa wrote a thesis on unremarkable figures in regional myth. It included a section titled, "The Donkey of Dionysus, Logistical Miracles and Agricultural Bureaucracy." The paper argued that stories like Felon's were vital not because they showed divine power and glory, but because they demonstrated divinity in administration, in things that functioned, in people who simply kept going. And what, the student asked, is more miraculous than a tired man being helped at exactly the moment he needs it? Did the donkey matter? We end, as we began, with the donkey. Its origins remain unclear. Perhaps it was conjured by Dionysus himself, slipping between worlds like the gods so often did. Perhaps it was just a lost beast, arriving by chance, its presence misinterpreted by a desperate man and a town eager for meaning. Or perhaps, and this is not to be dismissed lightly, it was real, divine, and dull by design. In a world of fire-breathing serpents and capricious gods, the donkey was an interruption, a favor without spectacle, a miracle without advertisement. And in that way, it echoed the deepest truth of history: that survival is often carried not by heroes, but by the unnoticed. By those who walk, who tie baskets well, who say thank you. And who, when lent a donkey, do not ask why. It is tempting to think of ancient Athens as a city of marble and philosophy, of gods in white robes and democracy discussed over amphorae of wine. But before all that, before the philosophers debated the soul, before the ships were built, and before the statues lined the agora, there were trees. Olive trees. Thousands of them. And before there were thousands, there was one. Its name, according to later inscriptions and quite a bit of mythological embroidery, was Moria. Not a proper name, but a category. Moria alias sacred olive. The story goes that this tree, planted by the goddess Athena herself during her contest with Poseidon for the patronage of the city, was the first of its kind. A divine gift, rooted in soil but bound by law. And it is law tedious, parchment-scraping, loophole-ridden law that governed the life of this olive, and the thousands that followed. This is not a story about battles or heroes. It is a story about how one man, Solon, stood between a tree and a mob. Solon, not quite a lawgiver, not yet a legend. Solon is remembered today as a statesman, a poet, and one of the 7 sages of Greece. But in his own lifetime, he was more of a crisis manager. Athens in the early 6th century BCE was a city on the edge of collapse. The aristocracy owned the land. The poor were indebted, sometimes enslaved. There was no clear legal code, only customs, punishments, and a growing unrest. It was not the kind of situation one fixes with a few well-placed reforms. But Solon, equal parts idealist and bureaucrat, gave it a try. Among his many reforms, one stands out as especially unremarkable to modern ears but utterly transformative at the time. He wrote legislation about trees. Not just any trees, olive trees. And he didn't write about them in terms of agriculture or aesthetics. He wrote about their ownership, their taxation, their felling, their relocation, their oil, their roots. Solon, in short, turned trees into policy. The olive economy. The reason was simple. Olive trees were the most valuable asset Athens had. They provided food, oil, and trade leverage. Olive oil was used not just for eating, but for lighting lamps, lubricating tools, and cleansing skin. It was a commodity and a currency. And unlike grain or grapes, olives demanded time. A newly planted tree took up to 10 years to produce a significant yield. This meant landowners who possessed old trees had real power. But it also meant that the destruction of olive trees by war, neglect, or anger was a risk to the entire city's survival. Solon's solution was both practical and strangely sacred. He declared certain olive trees sacred property of the state. These were not trees on public land. They were trees on private land, but the law now treated them as divine gifts to the city. You could tend them. You could harvest their fruit. But you could not, under any circumstances, cut one down. The first olive audit. To enforce this, Solon created what may be the first recorded case of state agricultural inspection. Every year, a team of elected officials called the Epimeletai was tasked with inspecting the condition of sacred olive trees. Their job was not glamorous. It involved long walks through rural plots, checking tree health, verifying ownership records, and ensuring that no tree had been removed. They carried scrolls. They measured shadows. They counted branches. And if a landowner was found to have removed a sacred tree, the penalty was severe: banishment, the confiscation of property, and possibly death. The process of deciding whether a tree was sacred involved its lineage. Trees traced back to Athena's original planting or grafted from one of her first sacred trees were considered moriae. These had to be registered in official city scrolls, which were updated during annual inspections. Historians still debate how many of these trees existed. Some estimates say dozens, others say hundreds. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, depending on how liberally one interpreted descended from Athena's olive. And people, as they tend to do, found loopholes. Bureaucracy and the borer beetle. An especially dull but revealing case involved a wealthy merchant named Menecrates, who was accused of accidentally allowing a sacred tree to be consumed by pests. The insects in question, probably olive borer beetles, had hollowed out the trunk over several years. Menecrates argued he had done nothing wrong. He had not felled the tree. He had merely failed to stop nature from doing its work. Solon's inspectors disagreed. The case made its way to the Athenian court. There, depositions were read aloud for hours. Witnesses were called to testify whether the tree had ever been pruned, whether goats had been allowed near its base, whether Menecrates had offered the usual first-press oil to the temple. In the end, he was fined not for felling the tree, but for administrative negligence of sacred property. This set a precedent. Even the non-removal of a sacred tree could be punishable if due diligence wasn't observed. The law had found its teeth. When trees became political, not everyone was pleased with Solon's olive protections. Some landowners, especially those far from the city center, saw the laws as overreach. Why should a tree on their land be subject to rules written in stone tablets they had never read? There were rumblings. One evening, according to a local record scratched into pottery fragments found in the suburb of Colonnos, a group of young men attempted to chop down a registered Moria. They were caught. 3 were punished with fines. 1 disappeared. It was never clear whether the punishment came from the state or from loyalists to Athena. Solon himself took no public position on the matter, but soon after, a new clause was added to the law. Let no man lay axe to root, nor flame to leaf, of tree touched by divine hand, lest he unmake the fortune of the city. A city of trees and paperwork. As Athens grew, so too did its paper trail. Scrolls multiplied. Olive registries filled city archives. Inspectors trained new inspectors, and sacred trees once few spread. Some were genuine. Some were claimed. If you wanted your tree to be protected from seizure, it helped to say Athena had once stood near it. Some farmers began planting their own sacred trees. Hopping the label would prevent future tax levies or eminent domain seizures. This required a ceremony, often led by a minor priest and witnessed by neighbors. The tree would be blessed, the soil salted, and a coin buried at its base. It became a whole genre of civic life, ritualized bureaucracy. And yet, underneath all the tedium and paperwork, something remarkable happened. The olive trees flourished. They were not cut for firewood or war. They were not ripped up in anger or debt disputes. They stood unbothered for generations. And in the shade of their branches, children played, scholars wrote, farmers harvested. What does this mean? Solon did not save Athens through warfare or genius alone. He saved it in part by making trees sacred through law. Not because he believed every olive was divine, but because he knew that if people treated them as such, the city might survive. And in doing so, he taught a lesson. Sometimes the boring thing, the inspection, the scroll, the annual audit, is the very thing that guards the soul of a city. But there is more to this story. Because in time, others would challenge the olive protections. A new generation would rise, hungry for expansion, indifferent to myth, and eager to reclaim their land. And one man would stand at the center of it again. But this time, Solon would not be there. Only his laws. And his trees. Athens matured. Markets grew wider, walls taller, and debates more sophisticated. But amid all that expansion, the trees remained. They stood in rows, knotted and gnarled, some bearing plaques with fatting inscriptions. Moria, sacred to Athena. Under protection of Law 42b, tourists ignored them. Children used them as hiding places during games, but farmers knew better. These trees were watched, catalogued, protected. And in the 6th generation after Solon's reforms, someone tried to undo all of it. The rise of their Sandros. He was not a tyrant, at least not in the beginning. Sandros was a wealthy landowner and a retired general with scars both visible and implied. His estate stretched across the outskirts of Athens, through the sun-baked slopes near Acharnae, and included at least 24 olive trees that, unluckily for him, had been labeled Moriae by a particularly enthusiastic inspector 3 decades earlier. They were old, crooked, unproductive, and standing exactly where he wanted to build a barracks for his newly formed militia. Sandros filed a petition, a request to reclassify the trees from sacred to domestic, a legal distinction that would place control fully back in his hands. This had never been done before. The court of root and ritual. The case was assigned to a special magistrate, a mid-level official named Hippones, who had previously overseen water rights and small inheritance disputes. He was not prepared for what followed. The court convened at dawn. By mid-morning, 3 full scrolls of evidence had been presented. The Rosandros argued, with some rhetorical flair, that no tree, however old, should outlast the needs of the living. He cited the low yield of his olives, the cracked trunks, the risk of fire. He questioned the validity of their sacred designation, claiming no one could confirm their origin. And then, crucially, he produced a retired priest who claimed that the trees had never been properly blessed in the first place. The opposition was led not by a priest or a politician, but by a farmer named Aeson. He had no titles, but he did have one thing: the registry. Aeson appeared before the magistrate holding a scroll wrapped in a worn linen sash. It was the official registry of Moriae, the sacred tree ledger maintained sporadically since Solon's time. His father had once been an inspector, so had his grandfather. He unrolled it slowly and pointed to the entry. Tree 7, east-facing slope, 30 cubits from the stone altar, designated sacred under Law 42b by decree of the Council of Archon Cleones, in the year following the failed barley harvest. There it was, ink-faded but legible. A sacred tree. The crowd grows. Word of the trial spread, not because of the trees but because of what they represented. If the Rosandros won, the precedent would be set. Sacred olive trees could be challenged, removed, reclassified. To the poor farmers and small landholders of Athens, this was unthinkable. These trees had become more than sacred; they were protection, not just from axes, but from debt seizures, crop quotas, and state overreach. To own a Moria tree was to be seen. To have it taken away was to lose even that. A crowd gathered outside the hearing. Some carried olive branches. Some carried ropes. The debate of scrolls and soil. Inside, the magistrate tried to maintain order. The Rosandros presented a new argument: intent. He claimed that the original inspectors had no way of knowing whether a tree was truly descended from Athena's first planting, that the sacred registry, while historic, was subject to error, that too many trees had been added over the years without sufficient vetting. He proposed a re-audit, every sacred tree in Attica re-verified, re-inspected. It sounded reasonable. It was terrifying. Bureaucratic blowback. Aeson replied without drama. He read aloud from Solon's own writings. What the people honor in law, they honor in practice. Let not the law be changed to suit the ambition of men, for that is not justice, but memory corrupted. He then submitted records showing that the Rosandros' estate had produced more olive oil than any other estate that year. The trees weren't unproductive, they just weren't convenient. Finally, he handed over a small amphora sealed, dusty, and labeled. First press from Tree 7, harvest of year 112 post-Solon. The oil inside still shimmered. The magistrate took it and said nothing. A decision not to decide. After 4 days of deliberation, Hippones issued a ruling that could only be described as artfully noncommittal. He ruled that the registry would remain in force. The trees in question would retain their Moria status, unless dead or fallen by natural means. No re-audit would be authorized without a majority vote of the assembly. Any further challenges would require proof of divine disfavor, a phrase with no clear legal definition. The decision satisfied no one, but it protected the trees. The Rosandros, furious, withdrew to his estate. He built his barracks elsewhere, planted fig trees in protest, and died 10 years later, reportedly poisoned by one of his own guards. The trees, as far as we know, still stand. The paper that binds. After the trial, Aeson made a copy of the registry, not because he feared it would be destroyed, but because he feared it would be forgotten. He trained new inspectors. He taught them how to read the old codes, how to measure shadow lengths, how to tell a healthy root system from a dying one. He created a simple motto that every new inspector had to learn. A tree cannot speak, but it can be spoken for. This phrase was carved into the lintel of the modest inspection office in the Agora. It was not poetry, but it became policy. The olive and the polis. The sacred trees of Athens endured not just because of law, but because of shared belief in that law. A belief so boring, so buried in paperwork, that no hero would bother to recount it in epic. But in that belief was a kind of resistance. To tyranny, to neglect, to the creeping desire to control the world not for survival, but for convenience. And so the trees remained. Even when war came, even when the plague came, even when the temples crumbled, people replanted, retied plaques, made new entries in the registry. Because the city remembered something simple: you protect what protects you, even if it's just a tree. But there was one final test still to come. A foreign power, a war that reached the roots, and a decision made in secret by a city desperate to survive. What happens when the only thing left to burn is sacred? By the 5th century BCE, Athens was no longer merely a city, it was an idea. A republic of law, debate, art, and empire. It had walls, ships, colonies. It had the Parthenon, it had Pericles. But it also had enemies. Sparta watched, Persia waited, and war once unthinkable between Hellenes became inevitable. When it came, the Peloponnesian War was not swift and glorious. It was slow, bleeding, and inside the city's long walls, where thousands sought refuge from invading Spartan forces, there came hunger. And with hunger came fire. The siege and the decision. In the second year of the war, Spartan forces swept across Attica, burning fields and groves. Their goal was not conquest, it was strangulation. Deprive Athens of its countryside, and you starve the city into submission. The Athenian citizens, protected behind their walls, watched the smoke columns rise in silence. But within those walls, food became scarce. Supplies from allies were delayed. Ships faced storm and blockade. In the Agora, crowds formed around grain merchants like flocks of birds around scattered crumbs. The assembly met in emergency session. And that was when the proposal was made. A young strategos unnamed in surviving records stood and asked, "What good are trees we cannot eat?" The olive fires. Cutting down sacred olive trees had always been unthinkable. Until it was. Under emergency decree, 5 Morii trees were felled, their branches used for fuel, their trunks for cooking fires. The decision was justified as a temporary suspension of sacred protocol in defense of the polis. No ceremony was held. No priest consulted. Just axes, chopped roots, cracked bark. And silence. The fires warmed thousands. They also lit a question no one dared ask aloud. If we can burn the sacred now, what won't we burn tomorrow? Erosion of the registry. The registry of Morii, for centuries a meticulous document, began to blur at the edges. Entries were skipped. Annual audits were suspended. Some inspectors, conscripted for war, never returned. Others refused to inspect at all, claiming the sacred was no longer theirs to measure. When a 6th tree was felled this time without any record or approval, an anonymous note was nailed to the inspection office door. The gods do not write scrolls, but they read them. No one claimed responsibility. No one responded. Athena's tree. The original sacred tree, the one believed to have sprung from Athena's spear, stood on the Acropolis. It was not a grand tree by that time, gnarled, short, more symbolic than fruitful. When the Persians had sacked Athens decades earlier, They had burned the temple around it. And yet, according to Herodotus, the tree sent forth a new shoot the very next day. Now in the shadow of war, that same tree became a point of tension. Some wanted to burn it ceremonially, to transform its destruction into a symbol of sacrifice for the city's survival. Others argued that to do so would be to sever the city's oldest root, its bond with Athena. The debate was fierce. It ended not with a vote, but with a storm. The lightning. One night rain swept the city. Thunder rolled down from Mount Hymettus. At dawn, the olive tree on the Acropolis was found split, its trunk blackened, struck by lightning. Superstition spread like wildfire. Some said it was a sign from Athena, others a warning. Some whispered that it was not lightning at all, but an act of arson covered by nature's disguise. The assembly convened again. This time they passed a new decree. Let the remaining moriae be left uncut, unburned, unclaimed by the needs of war. Their protection is to outlast our survival, lest we survive as something else. It was not a resolution of hope. It was a line drawn in smoke. After the war dragged on, then ended, then flickered again. When it finally ceased, Athens was broken. Its empire dissolved, its fleet humbled, its pride shattered. But the trees, some remained. Aesion's descendants returned to the inspection office. They found the registry covered in dust but intact. They reopened it, recounted, replanted. The new inspectors were young, born after the war, uninterested in fire, committed to roots. They visited every grove, marked new plaques, held simple ceremonies, wrote in slow, deliberate script. Verified sacred, living, witnessed. The registry began again, not as a symbol of power but of memory. The lesson in leaves. There is no epic written about the moriae, no grand poem about tree audits, no marble frieze depicting men with scrolls measuring branch width. But the story of Athens is incomplete without them. Because those trees represented something Athens forgot, then remembered. That greatness is not only in conquest, but in care. Not in growth alone, but in maintenance. Not just in what you build, but in what you refuse to destroy. Solon's laws, so boring, so procedural, were never meant to protect wood and leaf. They were meant to protect continuity, restraint, the idea that some things are sacred not because of divine decree, but because a society chooses to treat them that way. Even when it's inconvenient. Especially then. One tree remains. There's a story more myth than record that one Moria still stands. Outside the ruins of the old Agora, tucked behind a crumbling wall, its branches tangled with ivy. It bears no plaque, it is not registered. But each spring someone places a small amphora at its base, filled with a few ounces of oil, unmarked, unspoken. The tree has never been burned. And perhaps that is the real miracle. You may think you know the story of Ganymede, the beautiful boy from Troy carried off by Zeus to serve as cupbearer to the gods. A tale told in flashes, a god transformed into an eagle, a boy whisked away into the heavens, and a position of honor granted at the immortal table. But this story isn't about lightning or beauty. It is about serving wine. Endlessly, quietly, with your feet sore from standing too long, and your arms aching from amphorae just a little too full. Because Ganymede didn't just hold a cup, he managed the ceremonial pouring of immortal nectar, maintained ratios of wine to water, tracked each deity's preferred dilution, and ensured no ambrosia went to waste. And he did it all without aging, sleeping, or being allowed to leave. This is not a tale of romance or glory. It is a tale of work. Before the clouds, Ganymede was a prince. That much is true. He was born in the city of Troy, son of King Tros, after whom the city was named. He was praised for his appearance, yes, but more so for his demeanor, calm, attentive, and unusually quiet. According to a later account by a Hellenistic scholar, one whose scrolls remain barely legible under layers of mold, Ganymede was known not for speeches, but for listening. He once stood through an entire council meeting of his elders without blinking. That, more than his beauty, caught Zeus's attention. The gods did not crave rebellion, they craved service. And so Zeus, on a morning like any other, descended in eagle form and carried Ganymede into the sky. No blood, no battle, no drama. Just a quiet waft of wind over the plain, and a boy gone from the earth. Olympus and its order. Olympus was not a paradise of idleness, it was a bureaucracy. There were gods of harvest, gods of sleep, gods of thresholds. There were registries of rituals, calendars of feast days, protocols for divine interaction with mortals. And within this grand order was a symposium, a divine banquet that repeated itself, over and over, across centuries. At its heart stood Ganymede. He arrived without orientation. No mentor, no handbook, just an amphora in his hands and a nod from Hermes. He was given a simple instruction. Know who drinks what, keep the cups full, don't speak unless spoken to. Amphory and expectations. On his first day, Ganymede poured for Zeus. He held the amphora with both hands, keeping the spout tilted just so, ensuring no air bubbles gurgled up into the golden cup. He counted 3 beats, then stopped. A test. Zeus said nothing, which was praise enough. Then came Hera. She did not take wine, only spring water, lightly scented with hyacinth, but the water had to be gathered by moonlight and filtered through woven linen, a fact Ganymede learned only after delivering the wrong cup. Hera did not raise her voice. She simply looked at him for a long time and said, "Ask first, always." He did not make the mistake again. The ledger of liquids. After 3 weeks, Ganymede requested very politely a scroll and stylus. Not for poetry, for inventory. He began a log. Zeus, dry wine uncut, prefers Chian vintage. Refill every 30 minutes. Hera, spring water, hyacinth, no ice. Replace hourly. Ares will drink anything, overfills intentionally, warn before refilling. Athena, no wine, prefers olive infusion, serves herself when annoyed. Dionysus, never the same cup twice. Requests surprise me often, dangerous. This scroll, discovered much later in a temple ruin attributed to Dionysian worship, is considered one of the earliest examples of divine preference tracking, or what we might now call hospitality protocols. It is also believed to have inspired the onochoi, standardized wine-pouring jugs used throughout Greece. Ganymede, then, was not just a servant. He was a logistics innovator. The long shift. There was no night on Olympus, no sleep, no end to the feast. The gods dined eternally, and Ganymede stood eternally. To rest was to fail. So he found ways to pace himself. He alternated arms when pouring. He memorized each god's place at the table and developed shortcuts, pouring mid-step, pivoting without pause, skipping seats when he anticipated a god would step away for a moment. He even trained himself to breathe in rhythm with pouring, so his hands wouldn't tremble. This was divine service, but it was still service. And he was still a boy. The jealousy of Hebe. Before Ganymede, there was another cupbearer, Hebe, daughter of Hera. She had performed the role for centuries, and while her technique was less precise, her lineage was divine. Her replacement by a mortal was not well received. Hebe did not confront Ganymede directly. She did something far worse. She corrected him. Publicly, frequently, on matters of style. Your wrist turns too sharply. That was 4 beats, not 3. Dionysus's cup is chipped, replace it. Each remark was delivered with a pleasant tone and a fixed smile. Ganymede responded with quiet compliance, adjusting, learning, improving. Eventually, even Hebe had to admit, though not aloud, that the boy had a gift. Still, resentment brewed, and it would not remain unspoken forever. An overheard complaint. One evening, or its timeless Olympian equivalent Hera, spoke quietly to Zeus. You gave him eternity but no place. He stands among gods, Zeus replied. He stands, that's all he does. The words were not cruel, they were factual. Ganymede had been made immortal, given youth, beauty, and proximity to power. But he had no seat, no voice. He poured, he bowed, and in doing so, he became the most present being on Olympus and the most invisible. The pouring that changed everything. On the 50th cycle of the Banquet of Anthesteria, an event marking the release of new wine, Ganymede performed a flourish. It was not grand, just a subtle twist of the amphora, a circular motion that sent a ribbon of wine into Ares's cup with mathematical precision, no drops wasted. The table fell silent. Apollo smiled. Athena raised an eyebrow. Dionysus clapped. Zeus said nothing but nodded once. It was not the act itself that impressed them. It was the restraint within it, the clarity, the mastery of repetition honed into elegance. That night, Ganymede was offered a seat at the edge of the table. He declined and poured another round. Still pouring. The myths tell us that Ganymede became a constellation Aquarius, the water-bearer, a symbol of youth, of service, of divine favor. But ancient temple records suggest something quieter. Some say his scroll of divine preferences became standard reading for novice priests. Others claim that in certain Dionysian rites, a boy was chosen not for his beauty, but for his balance, his ability to pour without spilling, to move without speaking, to endure without recognition. That boy was said to be of Ganymede's kind, not chosen by gods, but trained, because the lesson was clear. Divinity might be dramatic, but eternity is logistics. And yet this story is incomplete, because there was a day when Ganymede made a mistake. And it did not go unnoticed. No one expected Ganymede to make a mistake. That was part of the problem. He had served for years, centuries, depending on the calendar you followed, without a drop misplaced, without a vessel cracked, without a word out of turn. He had become not just trusted, but assumed. But on the 17th feast of the mid-year renewal, when the gods convened for a celebration that was half ritual and half accounting session, Ganymede slipped. And it wasn't the wine that spilled. The wrong cup. It began with a mix-up so minor it might have gone unnoticed in any other realm. Athena and Artemis had switched places at the table. Artemis preferred the eastern breeze that day, and Athena, distracted by a parchment on civic boundaries, hadn't noticed. Ganymede, operating from memory, approached with a polished onycho and poured into the wrong cup. For the wrong goddess. Red wine for Artemis. She recoiled not out of offense but from sheer shock. She drank only water flavored lightly with pine. Red wine, sacred to Dionysus, symbolized chaos, revelry, and worst of all, impulse. Athena, realizing the mistake, remained silent. Artemis, ever composed, uttered just 3 words. "This is not mine." The silence that followed weighed more than thunder. Divine error protocol. There were procedures for mortal error on Olympus. Not written. Of course, such things were beneath the gods, but known. A mistake by a god could be reinterpreted as metaphor. A mistake by a mortal had to be explained. Zeus raised a hand. Ganymede froze. He stepped back, lowered the amphora, and waited. No defense. No tears. Only posture. Zeus spoke not to Ganymede, but to Hermes. "It's been long since anyone poured for Artemis." Hermes nodded. True, he poured from memory, not observation. There was a pause, then laughter. Not cruel, almost weary. Even perfection forgets to look. Hebe's return. The incident gave Hebe the opening she had been waiting for. She returned to the banquet, uninvited but not unwelcome, and offered to resume her role as cupbearer in the interest of ceremonial consistency. The gods debated, some agreed, others felt it unnecessary. Hera smiled but said nothing. Zeus, after long consideration, made a decision that would later be described in the scribbles of an unknown votive scribe as deliciously administrative. He split the role. Ganymede would continue to pour for the Olympian 12. Hebe would oversee rituals involving guests visiting deities, personified concepts like night or strife, or demigods attending on special feast days. Neither was demoted. Both were promoted. And now there was a chain of service. The logbooks. To support this change, Ganymede proposed a system of logbooks, individual scrolls for each guest's preferences, dietary restrictions, and drinking tolerances. Hebe adopted the system with enthusiasm, even adding decorative flourishes and sealing each log with a personalized wax stamp. Over time, the system expanded. The logbooks grew. So did the legend. Among the mortals, whispers began to spread that the gods' wine was no ordinary vintage, that it was informed by celestial calculations, timed by the pulse of eternity, and poured by a being whose wrist never faltered. They weren't entirely wrong. But they didn't know about the paperwork. The dull but crucial cup. Of all the roles on Olympus, Ganymede's was still considered the least glamorous. Heroes dined, muses sang, Hades occasionally dropped in with cryptic metaphors. Ganymede carried jugs. And yet the system around him, his logs, his scrolls, his memory had become essential. The gods noticed when he was missing. They noticed when he paused. Even Dionysus, the least predictable of them all, once remarked between hiccups, "He's the only one who remembers what I drank last time. Even I don't know." In a pantheon defined by ego, being remembered was a kind of immortality. And Ganymede gave them that. The shift of perspective. After the incident with Artemis, Ganymede changed his method. No longer did he rely solely on memory. He observed. He watched for minute adjustments, Hera turning her wrist before declining a refill, Ares fidgeting when ready for more, Hestia blinking exactly 3 times before raising her cup. He developed what modern scholars might call behavioral indexing. And he kept notes, not just for service but for reflection. An excerpt, found on a fragment of clay once buried near a rural Dionysian shrine, reads, "Artemis did not mind the wine, she minded the assumption. Zeus drinks more when it rains. Apollo taps the table when he's preparing to argue." These were not just observations, they were understandings. The kind a servant gains only when he becomes part of the furniture, invisible, but essential. A privilege of silence. One day Ganymede found himself alone in the banquet hall. The gods had dispersed. Only Hestia remained, seated by the hearth, her cup untouched. He approached quietly. "Would you like more?" She looked up. "Number sit." It was not a request. Ganymede sat. For a moment there was no pouring, no standing, no role to perform. Just stillness. And then Hestia, goddess of the hearth and home, said, "You know more than any oracle, but you speak like a stone." He considered her words. Then asked, "Would you have me change that?" She shook her head. "Not yet." Rumors among mortals. As centuries passed, the mortal world crafted their own interpretations. Some said Ganymede was punished for pride. Others claimed he was rewarded for submission. Poets romanticized his beauty. Philosophers debated the ethics of his abduction. Potters painted him with wings he never had. But no one asked how many cups he filled, or how many scrolls he wrote, or how many preferences he remembered so others wouldn't have to. And that, perhaps, was the real injustice. The second mistake. Later, much later, Ganymede would make another error. This time not in pouring, but in what he did not pour. And it would shake the hierarchy of Olympus in a way no god expected. Because the second mistake wasn't about a cup. It was about a refusal. And gods, above all else, hate to be refused. Olympus was accustomed to rituals. Immortality doesn't bring innovation, it brings repetition. The same feasts, the same songs, the same toasts. And the same cup, refilled, passed, lifted, and drained. But on one evening, if you can call anything in eternity an evening, a cup was left empty. Not forgotten. Intentionally unfilled. And the one who left it that way was Ganymede. The request. Ares was restless. He had returned from watching a skirmish between mortals in Thessaly, a dispute over border stones and stolen oxen. To a god of war, it was little more than a warm-up, but he arrived flushed with energy, seeking drink and someone to spar with verbally. He struck the table with his gauntleted hand. Poor boy. Ganymede stood just behind him. The jug was in his hand. He could smell the amphora's contents, rich, sharp, pressed under a full moon. But he did not move. I have recorded that you have reached your limit for the feast, he said, voice steady. 3 cups, as agreed by the council. Ares blinked. You quote scrolls at me. Yes, Ganymede replied. Then tear them. I cannot. Zeus, seated further down the table, raised a brow but said nothing. Athena lowered her eyes to her plate. Only Dionysus smiled. The principle. In prior centuries, yes, centuries Ganymede had poured without condition. He had observed, recorded, adjusted, but he had never refused. Until now. Because he had written the new protocol himself, after a particularly disruptive banquet had ended with a minor divine altercation that destroyed half of the chorus of echoes. The rule was simple: no more than 3 cups per deity per gathering, unless voted otherwise. Everyone had agreed. Even Ares. But gods forget. Or choose to. The refusal. Ares stood. His chair scraped stone. You will pour. I will not. The table froze. It wasn't the volume of their exchange. It was the fact of it. No one had refused a direct command from a god on Olympus, certainly not a servant, and certainly not a mortal-turned-immortal youth whose function was to serve. But Ganymede had made a choice. A deliberate, procedural, protocol-bound choice. And it was that dull reasoning that made it dangerous. Because a god can rage against rebellion, but against policy. That's harder. Intervention. Hera cleared her throat. The rule was passed in full council, she said. Let it stand. Ares turned toward her, nostrils flaring. He is a boy. He is a function, Athena corrected. A function we empowered. Then I revoke the function. Ganymede spoke. You cannot, only the council can. Zeus's voice low, firm, cut through the rising murmur. Enough. He turned to Ganymede. Why now? Ganymede did not blink. Because rules are for when it's inconvenient, otherwise they are decorations. The vote. What followed was not dramatic, no thunder, no lightning, just a procedural review. The gods voted. 9-3, they upheld Ganymede's refusal. Ares stormed from the hall. And Ganymede poured for no one that evening. He set down the jug, sat on the cool marble, and looked up at the open ceiling of Olympus. A change in status. After that night, Ganymede was no longer called the boy. He was called the Pourer of Limits, and though he continued to serve, he did so now with authority. He instituted shift rotations, even among immortals, created schedules for the banquets, demanded inspections of the amphory to prevent spoilage. It was said he once dismissed Dionysus's personal servant for improper corking. Dionysus laughed, then rehired the servant with better training. The stillness of service. Eventually, Ganymede no longer carried the jug himself. He directed others, young immortals or minor spirits, to pour on his behalf, but the gods still looked to him when the cup was passed. He had become more than a servant. He had become a standard. And standards endure. Even when beauty fades. Even when memory fails. Even when mortals forget the name. A mortal reflection. On earth, Ganymede's story became legend. Sculpted into fountains, painted on vases, debated in forums. But the lesson always was lost. They remembered the eagle. They forgot the discipline. They remembered the boy's beauty. They forgot the spilled cup. And the choice not to pour again. A star in silence. Aquarius, the water-bearer, still shines in the sky. Its stars curve like a tilted jug, pouring not wine, but emptiness, a quiet stream against the backdrop of heaven. It is said that on rare nights, if you stare long enough at the constellation, you can feel something less than sound. A pause. The moment before a decision. A still hand over a brimming cup. A boy no longer a boy, asking not, "What do the gods desire?" but, "What happens if I say no?" We often imagine Hera, queen of the gods, as a figure of grandeur, proud, regal, and often enraged. She is depicted in frescoes with a scepter in one hand and a peacock at her side. She presides over marriage, oaths, and fidelity, but rarely do the myths speak of her household. Not her divine lineage. Not her quarrels with Zeus. Not even her jealousies. But her housekeeping. Because somebody had to manage Mount Olympus, not its politics or its revels, but its linens, its textiles, the physical materials that made Olympus more than clouds and columns. This is the story of how the goddess Hera maintained an inventory of divine cloth, and how it once almost collapsed due to a missing bolt of celestial fabric. Olympus was a house. Before it was a symbol, Olympus was a structure. Whether stone or light, whether real or imagined, it had rooms, halls, sleeping chambers, storage. The gods, for all their power, needed space. And in that space there were beds. And on those beds there were sheets. And every few centuries, those sheets had to be replaced. The practice of divine textile rotation was governed by a schedule so complex that only two immortals understood it fully: Hera, and a minor spirit of counting known as Katomios, whose only known attribute was the ability to track folds in cloth without using his eyes. The fabrics used on Olympus were not woven by mortals. They were created in the loom of hours, a relic now lost to time, operated by attendants who no longer had names, only functions. It is believed that one bolt of this fabric could drape a mountain, yet fold into a drawer. They were rare, sacred, and precisely inventoried. The ledger. Hera kept a scroll. It was not gilded or bejeweled, but it was sealed with a personal wax signet, a coiled peacock feather within a circle. The scroll contained, in exhaustive detail, a line-by-line inventory of all cloth items on Olympus. An excerpt from a surviving fragment reads, 12 veils sheer, gold-threaded, spring ceremony use only. 18 sheets, solar bleached, Zeus's chamber, not for reassignment. 9 cushions, peacock blue, minor deities, alcove. 1 curtain, dusk-dyed, missing. It was that last entry, one curtain, missing, that began the crisis. The disappearance. The curtain in question was not large. It had once hung between two columns at the western end of the Hall of Arrival. It was woven from light harvested during a partial eclipse, dyed with the first shadows of dusk, and hemmed with silver threads drawn from the river Styx. Its purpose, none recorded. Its aesthetic, frequently complimented. Its value, immeasurable because it had no replacement. And one day it was gone. The audit. Upon noticing the curtain's absence, Hera ordered a full inventory audit. She summoned Catomios, who arrived with a quill made of straw and a blank scroll 3 meters long. They began at dawn. By nightfall, they had logged 764 items. The missing curtain remained unaccounted for. Hera, typically composed in matters of protocol, took this breach personally. It was not about theft. It was about neglect. Suspect. Though no formal accusation was made, an unspoken suspicion began to ripple through Olympus. Several possible culprits emerged. Hermes, for smuggling rare items to mortals. Aphrodite, for her interest in collecting rare fabrics. Apollo, whose temple furnishings were frequently borrowed from central stores. Hebe, for misfiling a delivery from the loom. But Hera made no accusation. She did something far more thorough. She commissioned a second scroll titled Supplemental Registry of Displaced and Misallocated Divine Textiles. It would become her masterwork. The nature of immortal linen. Immortal cloth is peculiar. It does not wear. It does not stain. But it moves. Not by magic, but by habit. Deities, especially the minor ones, would shift items casually, draping a celestial sash over a chair, taking a thunderproof blanket to a viewing tower, repurposing a curtain as a cloak for a symbolic entrance. And each time they did, they disrupted the ledger. Hera's frustration was not with chaos, but with carelessness. What was the point of eternity if you couldn't put things back? The assistant. To deal with the growing scale of the issue, Hera reluctantly accepted an assistant. Aclea, a mortal woman granted temporary immortality in exchange for 100 years of administrative service. Aclea had once been a linen keeper at a temple in Corinth. Her only divine talent was filing, and she was brilliant. She created new codes for categorizing divine cloth. SB sacred placement, ceremonial only. DR divine rest, bed linens for major gods. VU visual use, non-functional decorative. MIA missing, inactive assignment, items not seen in over one epoch. Aclea reduced Hera's cloth confusion by nearly 40% within a decade. The missing curtain, however, remained MIA. A trail of threads. It was eventually found. Or rather, its threads were found. During a routine inspection of Dionysus's private revel chamber, one notorious for bending every rule of order, a young dryad stumbled upon what she thought was a tapestry made of cloud stuff. But closer inspection revealed silver thread. A corner of dusk dye. It had been repurposed as a shawl by one of Dionysus's attendants, who had no idea the cloth had ever been a curtain, or that it had been woven from eclipse light, or that it had once been sealed under Hera's own wax signet. Resolution. The shawl was returned. It was cleaned, catalogued, and reassigned to a non-ceremonial context, a coverlet for Hera's viewing bench. The scroll was updated. The item reclassified from missing to altered use. No punishment was issued, but a new rule was added to the supplemental registry. Let no cloth woven from eclipse or dawn be moved without written authorization, witnessed by 2 and filed by 1. Signed Aclea. Sealed Hera. The boring divine. This episode is not remembered in myth. No poet sang of the missing curtain. No playwright dramatized Aclea's filing methods. And yet, for 100 years, no item went missing on Olympus. Not because of fear, but because someone had written things down. And because Hera, the queen of the gods, had cared enough to notice one missing curtain among thousands of glories. Because that's what keeps a world together. Not thunder, not beauty, inventory. But Hera's order would not last forever, because even scrolls age. And when Aclea's service neared its end, the gods were faced with a challenge. What happens when the keeper of divine order retires? And who volunteers to take her place? After nearly a century of unbroken records, Hera's linen archives remain the most complete inventory in Olympus, a triumph of quiet diligence. For 79 years, 2 months, and 16 days, the fabrics of the gods were accounted for, cross-referenced, color-coded, and sealed behind wax sigils. And at the center of it all was Aclea, former mortal, current immortal assistant, soon to be nothing. Because immortality, in Aclea's case, came with a clause. It was borrowed, and the due date was approaching. The 100-year term. Few mortals ever received temporary immortality. Fewer still were trusted with the inner order of Olympus. But Hera, ever the administrator, saw in Aclea what no other god had noticed: reliability. When they made their original arrangement, Hera had spoken plainly. 100 years, no more. You will not age, you will not sleep, you will not die. But when the term ends, your thread is cut. And what happens then? Aclea had asked. You return to where you were meant to be. Aclea accepted. She was 34 at the time. By her 99th immortal year, she looked exactly the same. But her eyes had changed. She no longer looked upward. She looked at lists. A city of scrolls. Under Aclea's direction, the supplemental registry of divine textiles expanded into a full linen bureau. It had 3 chambers: the silken wing for ceremonial fabrics, the wool alcove for utilitarian items and blankets, the unlabeled drawer, which no one opened without divine clearance. Within the bureau were subcatalogues, updated by elemental assistants, wind spirits filing cloaks, dryads handling fiber requests, and one silent titan who only measured tapestries. Aclea trained them all, and every scroll bore her handwriting, efficient, spare, and unmistakably human. The notice. It came in the form of a whisper, not from Hermes or Iris or a formal courier, but from the loom itself. The same place that produced immortal cloth now spun a final length, a silvery thread, tinged at one end with pale red, the marker of a completed life weave. It appeared on Aclea's desk. No message, just the thread. She knew what it meant. Preparing the exit. Aclea did not panic. She did what she always did, prepared a transition plan. She compiled instructions: how to calculate thread counts across temporal folds, how to log a missing item when the item never officially existed, how to file an exemption for fabric involved in divine metamorphoses. She even left tips on peacock feather care for Hera's ceremonial garments. Her last document was titled, On Fatting with Dignity, Notes from a Temporary Immortal. She sealed it with the original wax stamp. She'd been given a coil of peacock feather in a circle. Then she sat down to wait. Hera's reaction. When Hera learned of Aclea's pending expiration, she did not rage. She called a meeting. Just her and Aclea. No scrolls, no wine, no ceremony. Only 2 chairs. You do not have to go, Hera said. I do. We can extend it. You could, but you shouldn't. Hera studied her, not as a servant but as a keeper of order. Do you regret it? Aclea shook her head. No, I regret that there isn't a replacement. The problem of continuity. There were applicants, ambitious spirits, demigods, even a few mortals seeking favor. But none could do what Aclea had done. Because her power wasn't divine. It was mundane. She remembered things, she wrote them down, she checked her own work. No charm, no flame, no miracle. Just attention. The kind that cannot be gifted. Only chosen. The morning of departure. Aclea's final act was to review the annual folding ceremony, a ritual she herself had written, in which divine bedsheets were aired in the sun to symbolically mark a new season. She watched from a balcony. Then, just before midday, she walked to the central registry chamber. Her records were already in order. Her seals already cooled. At the stroke of solar apex, she placed her stylus on the final scroll. It was absorbed into the parchment. Her name disappeared. And she with it. Aftermath. No statue was raised. No god wept. But something shifted. For weeks, items went unlogged. A curtain went missing again. A ceremonial veil was folded improperly. One of the peacock cushions was placed in a rain-exposed atrium. Hera noticed. So did the others. Eventually, a new system emerged, slower, more distributed, less perfect. But the registry endured. Because Aclea had left structure. Even in vanishing, she preserved what mattered. What the records say. On the final page of the Linen Bureau's master scroll, in faint script no assistant ever admitted writing, there is one last line. Mortal clerk expired, functions retained, cloths still folded, order maintained. It is not a tribute. It is a fact. And perhaps that is the highest honor in Olympus. But a question lingered. What happens to a soul that returns from immortality? Did Aclea reappear in her temple in Corinth, a century out of time? Did she fade into memory? Or did she return to the loom, not as cloth but as thread, waiting to be woven again? Before Greece had gods on Olympus, before Athens stood tall or Sparta took arms, there was Knossos. A city of labyrinthine corridors and frescoes in red and blue, where bulls leapt and priests kept silent, where palaces were not fortresses but filing systems. For Knossos was not just a center of ritual, it was a center of record-keeping. And beneath the painted walls and mythic stories of minotaurs and queens, there worked a man with no legend, a scribe, a function, a name lost to time, etched only in the grooves of clay. He did not shape history. He recorded it. And this is his story. The Forgotten Room. It was the smallest chamber in the west wing of the palace. Roughly 3 strides wide, 2.5 long. No window. No fire pit. No throne. Just a ledge of stone, a wooden stool, and a basket of damp straw for pressing clay into smooth, rectangular tablets. No one entered without cause. There was no door, just a curtain. Behind it sat the man who recorded the entire economic life of Knossos: grain stores, sheep counts, bronze shipments, olive oil production, and temple offerings. He did not write in Greek. He wrote in Linear B. And he did not write poetry. Only numbers. The clay. The tablets were made from river clay, pulled before sunrise when it was most pliable. Each morning, apprentices brought bundles to the scribe, shaped into the familiar palm-sized slabs. He worked with a reed stylus, pressing into the clay in swift, angled marks that few could read, not even most of the palace officials. The writing wasn't meant to be read aloud, it was meant to last. Once a tablet was dry, it was baked in the sun. Some were stored, others were recycled, soaked, and reshaped when the numbers changed. Only a few were accidentally preserved, those caught in the fire that consumed the palace centuries later. We know his work only because it burned. The silence of the scribe. He is referred to in modern scholarship as hand 124, named after the distinct shape of his marks. Slightly crooked strokes, a faint downward angle, a tendency to separate entries with an unusual vertical line. From these quirks, archaeologists believe one man created over 800 tablets, each one written without flourish, each one exact. He never signed his name, but his existence is known through sheep counts, bronze tallies, oil jar inventories. The weight of an entire society resting on his meticulous habit. The rhythm of work. His life followed the harvest calendar. Grain season meant tallies of wheat amphorae. Sheep shearing brought weeks of scribbling wool weights and fleece colors. Temple festivals required fastidious lists of offerings, honey, incense, and small amounts of gold thread. He worked by natural light. No scribe wrote at night. Eyes were precious. Mistakes dangerous. One incorrect mark could cause a village to be undersupplied, or a priestess to miss her ceremonial textiles. So he checked. Twice. Then again. Not from pride, but because he was the only one allowed to. The account of the olive. Among his most notable entries was the record of a particularly abundant olive yield in the 13th year of the reigning high priest king. The entry reads, 34 jars pressed, 11 held for ceremony, 2 lost to spoil, 21 for trade to islands, total sealed and recorded. It's a dry record. But historians now believe that this exact transaction allowed Knossos to barter for the bronze used in palace gate reinforcements, delaying a Mycenaean incursion by several months. The scribe never knew. He only wrote what was reported. But the inkless groove of his stylus held a decision that changed the city's fate. A life of no story. There are no frescoes of scribes. No hymns to their hands. The palace art shows dancers, bulls, feasts, not the man bent over clay, mumbling the names of villages and checking figures on a palm slate. But his was a sacred task, not by divine inspiration, but because he kept things from falling apart. The livestock, the rations, the offerings, none of them mattered if no one wrote them down. And in Knossos, where gods required gifts and ships required supplies, nothing existed until it was logged. He knew this. He never spoke of it. He just kept writing. The fire. Sometime around 1450 BCE, fire swept through Knossos. Whether from rebellion, invasion, or misfortune, no one can say for certain. But the room without a door burned hot and fast. The scribe's stool charred. The curtain disintegrated. And the basket of raw clay hardened mid-form, freezing in place the last tablets he never finished. Ironically, it was this fire that preserved his work. The heat baked the tablets into permanence, rendering them artifacts. Before that, they were only tools. Afterward, they were history. We do not know his name, but we know his handwriting. We know how many sheep he recorded in spring. We know which village underdelivered wool in the 12th year. We know he corrected a mistake in copper tallies by striking through and rewriting a rare and careful act. We know he cared, even if no one else noticed. But there's more. Because one tablet, just one, contains something unusual. A line that does not fit the pattern. A phrase not part of inventory. A message. A warning. A sentence buried in the tablet's corner in his hand, never translated definitively. It reads, "The numbers wait, the sea does not." The fire that baked the tablets of Knossos may have been a tragedy, but for history it was a gift. It preserved a moment, an archive of economics, of ritual, of everyday logistics frozen in clay. Among these, the work of hand 124, the scribe whose name we still do not know, stands out for its quantity, precision, and subtle deviation. Because on one of his final tablets, tucked in a margin too thin to be purposeful, he wrote, "The numbers wait, the sea does not." It is the only non-accounting sentence in the entire archive, and it has puzzled scholars for over a century. Reading between the lines, Linear B was not designed for poetry. It is a utilitarian script mostly syllabic, with ideograms for common goods like grain, livestock, or cloth. It does not lend itself to personal commentary. Yet this sentence does not belong to a shipment ledger. It appears on a tablet listing shipments of wool cloaks to nearby port towns. The rest of the document follows typical format: quantity, item, destination, overseer. But the final line, "the numbers wait, the sea does not," breaks all conventions. It has no symbols for goods, no totals, just syllables, and it is signed with his unique vertical stroke, as if to say, this one is his. The context of the sea. Knossos depended on the sea. Its trade routes stretched across the Aegean, through the Cyclades as far as Anatolia and Egypt. Ships came and went with bronze, grain, oil, and wool, but sailing was not a flexible enterprise. One left port when winds were favorable, not when a scribe had tallied up his records. Delays were costly. A misfiled shipment meant a missed ship, and a missed ship meant late payments, unfulfilled offerings, or political embarrassment. The scribe would have known this. Perhaps he saw delays creeping in, officials slow to deliver numbers, merchants quarreling over allocations, priests disputing ceremonial needs, and maybe, just maybe, he had enough. And so he wrote, in the only space left to him, "The numbers wait, the sea does not." Not a complaint, a reminder. The rhythm of the tablets. In analyzing Hand 124's work, scholars have identified a curious pattern. His earliest tablets were written in clear, spaced syllables with generous margins and centered headings. But as years progressed, his tablets grew denser, margins narrowed, characters compressed. The writing became faster, tighter, more urgent. Some believe this reflects political pressure. Knossos was not isolated. The Mycenaean mainland loomed nearby, and tensions may have risen. Supplies might have been hoarded, ships redirected, local records squeezed to keep up with fluctuating demands. The scribe was not insulated from these changes. He was buried in them. A silent protest. Some archaeologists believe the message was a form of resistance. Not rebellion, he was no warrior, but a kind of bureaucratic whistleblowing. He didn't destroy the records. He didn't strike through entries. He simply wrote something human in a space designed for counting. The numbers wait. A commentary on the bureaucracy itself, its slowness, its inertia, its tendency to assume the world would always pause for paperwork. The sea does not. A quiet observation that the natural world and the people navigating it had their own clock. And that maybe, just maybe, the record keepers were falling behind. The scribe's final days. We do not know how the scribe died. It is likely he perished in the same fire that preserved his tablets. Or perhaps he fled, taking none of his work with him, leaving only these clay slips to tell his story. One burned tablet damaged, fragmentary, includes what may be his final entry: a shipment of oil jars marked deferred, a rare term in the archive. Deferred until when? Until whom? The answer is ash. Rediscovery. When British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans uncovered the Palace of Knossos in the early 20th century, he discovered hundreds of clay tablets buried in debris. At first, he thought they were ceremonial. Later, he realized they were administrative ledgers and logs. One collection stood out: a dense cluster of tablets, uniform in style, all bearing the hallmarks of a single hand. That hand, our hand 124, became the basis for understanding the bureaucratic infrastructure of the palace. And in those countless lists of goods and tallies, that single sentence stood out like a heartbeat. The numbers wait, the sea does not. A modern interpretation. Today, in some university courses on archival studies, students are shown a photograph of that tablet. It is used not as an example of linear B, but of something else. Clerical awareness. The ability to understand that records are not the world, they are only its shadow. And that when the world changes, a scribe must notice, even if he cannot stop it, even if all he can do is press a few words into wet clay before it dries. The myth that never was. There is no myth of the quiet accountant of Knossos. No constellation named for him. No temple offering to scribes. But somewhere, perhaps, in the archive of Poseidon's realm, there is an index, a list of mortals who watched the tides and said, "I cannot control the sea, but I can count what it leaves behind." And perhaps that was enough. But there is one question still unanswered. What happened to the missing shipment recorded as deferred? And what did the scribe know that no one else did before the palace fell? When the fire came to Knossos, it didn't ask for permission. It spread fast through storerooms lined with oils, across wooden beams dried from years of sun, through thatched corridors and curtain-closed chambers. The great palace, which had stood for generations as the administrative center of Minoan civilization, did not collapse in war or siege. It crumbled under the weight of disuse and fire. And in one small corner of that labyrinth, where daylight barely reached and the clay was kept cool and damp, the last tablet of hand 124, the quiet accountant, was caught in the flames. And baked perfectly. The final tablet. The artifact now rests in a museum display case, though few visitors pause to look closely. The display reads, Linear B tablet, late Minoan period, inventory ledger, untranslated annotation in margin. But to scholars of Bronze Age administration, it's more than a ledger. It is a question. Because unlike the hundreds of tablets bearing columns of neatly tallied items, wool, grain, sheep, this one ends abruptly, with a single word. Deferred. There is no total. No destination. No priest's name. Just that one word. Written in the same hand. Then nothing. The nature of delay. In Minoan logistics, deferred, Paki Tiro and linear B syllabary was rarely used. It meant to be completed later due to uncertainty. A kind of clerical pause. It was not a cancellation. It was a breath. And the entry deferred was not minor, it was for 90 amphorae of oil. Enough to light the ceremonial chambers for an entire moon cycle. Enough to trade for multiple bronze ingots. Enough to tip the balance of a fragile treaty with a coastal village rumored to be considering Mycenaean alliances. Why would the scribe delay it? And why write no reason? The coastal messenger. One interpretation, favored by economic historians, involves a failed delivery. A clay seal from a nearby harbor town, discovered decades later, includes a simple declaration. Ship delayed, storm cargo held, awaiting further order. The seal matches the date of the deferred oil tablet. It's possible the accountant received this message too late. Or perhaps he never received it at all. Perhaps he heard rumor of it in the palace courtyard, then returned to his chamber and did the only thing he could. Pressed a single word into the clay. Deferred. A different theory. But some scholars see something more deliberate. They point to subtle irregularities in the final tablet. The spacing is off, compressed, rushed. The stylus pressure is heavier than usual. The margin line is slightly crooked. Signs perhaps of distress, or knowledge of something incoming. Perhaps the scribe knew the palace was doomed by politics or weather or invasion. Perhaps the oil was no longer safe to move. Perhaps the numbers could no longer be trusted. And instead of recording a lie, he chose silence. A one-word resistance. Deferred. The role of the scribe. In Bronze Age palatial economies, the scribe was more than a secretary. He was a filter. Everything official passed through his hands. The movements of grain, the levies of wool, the tribute paid to gods, the redistribution of resources. If one wanted to control a palace, one might look first to its armies or priests. But to maintain one, you look to the scribe. And this one hand 124 chose to stop. Just for a moment. The tablet that waits. Some have suggested the tablet was never meant to be fired. That it would have been rewet, corrected, rewritten had the fire not come. That deferred was never final. That it was only a placeholder. But history does not always honor intentions. The fire came. The palace burned. The scrolls of linen were lost. The bulls stopped dancing in fresco. The songs of the double flute fell silent. But this tablet, with its unfinished entry and solitary word, remains. What it meant to record. The work of a scribe is not dramatic. It is not sung in epic verse. But it is what turns activity into structure, what turns goods into economy, what turns ritual into history. The quiet accountant of Knossos didn't build ships. He tracked their departures. He didn't pray to the gods. He ensured their temples had lamp oil. He didn't rule the city. But he knew where everything was. Until one day he didn't. And that absence is the only record we have of his voice. The message in the margin. The numbers wait, the sea does not. What is that if not prophecy? A warning that the world moves faster than the structures we build to hold it. A whisper from a man forgotten, whose fingers etched meaning into wet clay that would outlast the city itself. A note perhaps to us, to remember that there is power in the smallest job. That preservation is not always about strength. Sometimes it's about a man in a dark room, scratching a message into clay while the winds outside shift. And sometimes even that man must stop, must mark something as deferred, and let the fire come. Before email, before the post horn, before the ink-dotted parchment sealed with wax, there was the message that didn't arrive. And somewhere, likely forgotten under the ashes of a collapsed roof or crumbling road, was the first lost letter. In a world where words often traveled by feet, by beast, or by flickering memory, communication was never guaranteed. Delays weren't errors. They were reality. So what happened when Hermes, the fleet-footed god of messages, forgot his sandals? Nothing. Because the world kept turning slowly, unpredictably, but still moving forward under a system of messengers, runners, and clerks whose names never made the myths. This is their story. The human Hermes. While the mythic Hermes bore wings on his heels and rarely stumbled, the real ancient messengers were flesh and breath sweaty, sunburnt, and usually underpaid. In the 6th century BCE, the Athenian city-state employed hemerodromoi, day runners who carried messages from city to city, often on foot, over hundreds of miles. No mailbags, no uniforms. Just the message often memorized or carved into tablets in their feet. The average message from Athens to Sparta took around 2–4 days if conditions were ideal. But how often were they? Flooded rivers, bandits, war zones, mountain lions, mudslides, cramps. These runners were the circulatory system of early diplomacy, and clots were common. The message that never made it. One of the earliest recorded instances of a catastrophic postal failure comes not from Greece, but from Hadusa, capital of the Hittite Empire. In a cuneiform tablet found in the ruins of the Royal Archive, A king complains. We sent 5 donkeys with letters to Egypt. None have returned. Where are the scribes? Where is the response of Pharaoh? Archaeologists have pieced together the likely scenario. A diplomatic envoy traveling across harsh Anatolian terrain was caught in a rockslide. No bones were found, but their tablets, still sealed in clay casings, were unearthed centuries later, unread, unopened. A war almost started, because mail failed. The cost of delay. In the ancient world, timing meant more than convenience. It meant survival. A missed message could mean reinforcements that never arrived at a besieged city. Diplomatic gifts interpreted as insults. Shipments spoiled in port while awaiting release orders. A son not learning of his father's death until after the mourning season passed. One particularly telling case. In 5th century BCE Athens, a vote was delayed because a crucial courier from the countryside had not arrived. When he did, hours late and limping, his wax tablet had melted in the sun. The vote went forward without his information. The outcome? A minor tax change. But for the farmers he represented, it meant another year of hardship. Systems without systems. There was no unified postal system in most early empires. Instead, messaging was fractured. Kings employed their own runners. Merchants hired trusted slaves or guards. Temples used scribes on donkeyback. Army generals relied on scouts and riders. Every message came with risk. If you wanted certainty, you sent 2. If you were wealthy, you sent 3, along different routes. If it really mattered, you sent a copy via boat and another by foot. The idea of next-day delivery would have been laughed out of the agora. And yet, people depended on the unreliable because they had no alternative. The unnamed clerk. In one of the preserved papyri from Rome and Egypt, there is a letter written from one clerk to another. We await the schedule. Our granary is not yet listed. Did you forget us? Or did the courier forget the road? We don't know if that message was ever answered. But we know the grain never arrived. Perhaps a clerk misplaced the schedule. Perhaps a sandstorm buried the route markers. Perhaps the camel simply sat down and wouldn't move again. There were no tracking numbers. No, your parcel is delayed due to unforeseen divine mischief. Only silence. When gods failed. Even in myth, messengers fail. One lesser-known myth tells of Hermes delivering a love letter from a nymph to a mortal shepherd. On the way, he stopped to flirt with a wood sprite, misplaced the message in a laurel bush, and never finished the delivery. The nymph, thinking herself rejected, turned to stone. The shepherd, confused, married someone else. The story is sometimes used in moral instruction. Even gods get distracted. And when they do, mortals pay the price. The sandals of Mercury. In Rome, Mercury was the swift-footed messenger god, often conflated with Hermes. But Rome, ever practical, saw the flaw in divine unreliability. So they built the cursus publicus, a semi-state-run postal system under Augustus Caesar. Horse stations at regular intervals. Way stations stocked with food and fresh messengers. Letters could now travel up to 50 miles per day. It was progress, but it was not perfect. Because even with horses, even with roads, the sandals could still be forgotten. Paper was stolen. Horses broke legs. Ink smudged. Delays happened. And Mercury, immortal as he was, never filed a complaint. The irony of preservation. Today, most of what we know about ancient correspondence comes from letters that were lost. Letters preserved not because they were read and saved, but because they fell behind a shelf, were buried in a disaster, or never reached their destination. In a rubbish heap outside Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, Thousands of papyri were discovered, many never delivered, never opened, never answered. These are the letters that survived time, because no one had time to destroy them. And in this way, the delayed became the immortal. But one wonders, what message never delivered, never received changed a life? What reunion was missed? What peace was unmade by a misplaced scroll? And what clerk somewhere still waits for a reply that will never come? When we picture ancient roads, we often imagine wide Roman highways paved with heavy stone slabs and lined with milestones. But most messages in the ancient world never traveled those grand routes. They traveled instead along goat tracks, across riverbeds, through reeds, up muddy embankments, and over paths known only to shepherds and tax collectors. The journey of a message in the ancient world was more like a gamble than a guarantee. And even when the infrastructure was strong, when a message had the good fortune of being dispatched from a palace, it still faced the same unpredictable trifecta: weather, wilderness, and human will. The forgotten pigeon. One early attempt to accelerate communication involved birds. In ancient Egypt and later Greece, pigeons were used to carry short messages, often announcements or warnings. They worked remarkably well when they worked. A recovered tablet from a Cypriot temple includes a passing complaint. The pigeon was returned, but the scroll was gone. Next time, use the boy. Historians speculate the scroll slipped from the pigeon's thread, or perhaps a hawk intervened. The gods, apparently, did not ensure air mail. A message at the edge of empire. In the British Museum sits a wooden writing tablet from Roman Britain, dated to the early 2nd century CE. It is written in Latin, a letter from one Roman soldier to another stationed along Hadrian's wall. The message is not urgent, merely an invitation. Brother, come celebrate the Saturnalia feast. Bring warmth and don't forget the dice. But the letter was never delivered. It was discovered decades later, buried beneath the remains of a collapsed barrack. Perhaps the courier was reassigned. Perhaps the letter fell during transit. We'll never know. What we do know is that a feast was held, and someone didn't show up. Couriers and corruption. Postal systems, such as they were vulnerable to more than weather and terrain. They were subject to human behavior. A letter could be read en route and rewritten, bribed away, traded for favors, forgotten in the bottom of a wine flask. In 1st century BCE Alexandria, a papyrus reads, "The message bearer stopped in the port town and has not returned. He was seen with dancers." It's signed by an exasperated merchant. Even in ancient times, messages were sometimes ignored for better company. The profession of delay. In the Persian Empire, one of the most advanced pre-modern postal systems was the Angarium, a network of mounted couriers with dedicated relay stations. Messages could move remarkably fast, especially for royal business. But even this system wasn't immune to a basic problem: disinterest. The further from the center of power, the less motivation local officials had to ensure delivery. An account from a satrap in Lydia laments, "I sent the edict twice. Either they lie or they sleep." The edict in question, a routine tax adjustment. Not glorious, not urgent, just bureaucracy. And in the world of letters, bureaucracy moved last. Memory as message. In many early societies, particularly before widespread literacy, the most common form of message delivery was not on papyrus, clay, or parchment. It was oral. Messengers memorized entire speeches, lists, or treaties and delivered them from memory. In some cases, these verbal couriers trained for years in repetition techniques. It was an art form and a burden. But sometimes they simply forgot. A Babylonian temple record from around 1500 BCE notes, "The boy returned. He remembers the name, not the number. The message was half lost. It was enough to delay a shipment for 2 weeks. No message without a road. Infrastructure determined communication. In monsoon season, roads in India became rivers. In winter, alpine passes were closed. In the Arabian desert, couriers risked heat stroke. On the steppes, a message could ride for days before finding anyone to deliver it to. A single downed bridge could halt correspondence for weeks. But because delays were so common, ancient officials developed a culture of redundancy. For critical messages, couriers were given multiple copies. Dispatches were carved into stone or lead so they couldn't be tampered with. Some were even spoken aloud in public, in case the written version never arrived. It was not about certainty. It was about trying again. The lost packet of Rhodes. In 304 BCE, during the siege of Rhodes by Demetrius Poliorcetes, a packet of urgent diplomatic letters was dispatched by ship to Ptolemaic Egypt, seeking assistance. The boat never arrived. Later excavation of the harbor revealed a shipwreck from the correct time period, buried beneath centuries of silt. Among the few artifacts recovered, a copper cylinder sealed at both ends. Inside, parchment, illegible, too damaged by seawater to read. But scholars assume it was the very packet. Rhodes survived the siege, but barely. How different would things have been had the letter arrived in time? We'll never know. Patience as a system. In all these examples, one element stands out more than the parchment, the messenger, or the route. Patience. The ancients didn't just tolerate delay, they expected it. The assumption was not, how fast will it arrive, but will it arrive at all? And so, systems of waiting developed. Clerks double-checked logs after a month. Messengers were given weeks of leeway before being considered lost. And in some places, an answer received after a year was still considered prompt. Imagine a system built on faith, not in speed, but in eventuality. But then, what was the cost of that patience? What warnings were no longer warnings by the time they arrived? What promises became obsolete? And what messages never delivered still sit beneath dust and ash, waiting to be opened? By now it is clear. The ancient world wasn't connected by wires or algorithms. It was strung together by hope, memory, and wandering feet. Yet even amid these obstacles, collapsed bridges, wandering pigeons, sandstorms, distracted couriers, people still sent messages. Because to communicate, even in uncertainty, is to hope. But what happens when the message does arrive? When it isn't just delayed, but lost? Messages that miss their moment. Historians have unearthed countless letters from antiquity that were never opened. A wax tablet from 2nd century CE Gaul was found with its seal intact. Addressed from one merchant to another, it simply read, "About the shipment, delay further, the tax has doubled." But the seal tells us it was never read, which means the recipient never knew. The shipment likely went forward, the tax was charged, profits vanished. And the letter meant to avert a mistake became a record of miscommunication, preserved in silence. Rome's mail, not yours. Though Rome's famed cursus publicus is often credited as the first state-organized postal system, it was never for the public. Only state officials and imperial couriers could use it. If you were a merchant or citizen, you relied on slaves, tavern keepers, sailors headed in the right direction, or anyone with a trustworthy face. The Roman writer Pliny once mentioned sending letters with a friend of a friend's servant who seemed honest enough. There was no tracking, just trust. And sometimes that trust was misplaced. The courier's burden. While the stories of delayed messages often focus on what was lost, It's worth pausing to consider the couriers themselves. They walked for days. They faced illness, robbery, conscription, bad maps, worse directions, and sometimes death. In a Greek inscription outside a temple in Delphi, a short poem is etched. I walked from Thebes to Delphi, with messages from a mother to her son. He had already died, but I still delivered the words. There is no record of the message, only that the messenger fulfilled his duty, even if the words came too late. The unsent letters of Vindolanda. Near Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, archaeologists discovered wooden tablets containing the everyday correspondence of Roman soldiers and citizens. Among them, invitations to birthdays, complaints about boots, orders for wine, and one letter, carefully penned, never sent. Brother, I forgive you. The debt is forgiven. Return if you can. The ink had faded, but not enough to erase the meaning. The recipient never returned. Perhaps he died. Perhaps he never received the message. But there it remained for centuries, buried in the mud of northern England, a silent reconciliation never heard. The echoes in clay. From Mesopotamia to Egypt, thousands of clay tablets were written, fired, and stored. Many contain copies of letters that were sent, proof, perhaps, that someone tried to reach out. Others bear no indication of being copied or dispatched. They sit alone in archives, sometimes wrapped with string, sometimes broken. These are the unsent. Messages never delivered, perhaps never meant to be. One Assyrian scribe in the 7th century BCE wrote a letter to his wife. It was sealed, but not addressed. It reads, "You are in the garden when I close my eyes. I dream you carry figs." It is not political. It is not a request. It's just a thought, a fragment of affection. Unsent. Delays as a cultural constant. Over time, people adapted to the unpredictability of communication. Greek philosophers warned their students to write letters as if strangers might read them, because often strangers did. Roman officials wrote instructions in triplicate, assuming at least one copy would vanish. Persian generals sent runners and riders, betting one would survive. Chinese scribes used symbols of urgency, not to speed up delivery, but to warn of delays cost. In every case, people planned around the idea that communication was not instant, nor perfect. It was a flickering torch in a rainstorm. Faith in the delivery. And yet perhaps the most astonishing fact is this. Despite all odds, some letters did arrive. Across mountain passes, through rebellions, amid disease outbreaks. In the hands of limping runners or exhausted slaves, some messages made it home, and they changed lives. They warned cities, they prevented battles, they preserved marriages. But history rarely remembers the successful ones, because those letters were read and then forgotten. It is the delayed, the lost, and the unsent that become immortal, because no one had the chance to destroy them. In the end, the words remain. Today, a museum case might hold a letter you were never meant to read, a wax tablet, a chipped piece of pottery, a rolled bit of papyrus, sealed, burned, buried. And inside, a complaint, a blessing, a final word from a forgotten man to a dying friend. The sandals were forgotten, the runner delayed, the gods distracted, but the words remain, still waiting to be opened. So then, what messages are still waiting beneath the ground? What forgiveness lies unread? What warning is centuries too late? And when will the final lost letter finally be found? In the heart of Mesopotamia, sometime around 1800 BCE, a man sits cross-legged in a sun-baked room. His tools are few, a sharpened reed, a tablet of damp clay, and a list in his head. His job? To count, 2 cups of barley, 1 jar of oil, half a sheep paid in labor rather than meat. He is not a priest or a king or a warrior. He does not speak in myths or command from thrones. He is a scribe. And what he writes neat, wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay, will become the quiet scaffolding of one of the most influential civilizations in human history. The oldest paper trail. The Babylonians left behind no pyramids, no marble temples with fluted columns, no epic ruins like Rome or Athens. But they left something else. A staggering number of clay tablets. Hundreds of thousands, in fact. Some contain law codes or literature, but most. They are receipts, ledgers, inventories, agreements. And from them, historians have reconstructed a world not of epic conquest, but of accounting. The tablet of Lugal Kushim. Take one of the oldest known, named individuals in history. Not a king, not a poet, but a scribe, Lugal Kushim. His name appears on a tablet dated to around 3200 BCE. The content: a receipt for 29,086 measures of barley delivered over 37 months. That's it. No drama, no myth, just quantities and time. But in this document, we see the emergence of administrative thought, how to track production, define work, organize time, and ensure payment. This isn't just math. It's civilization. Writing to count. Cuneiform writing didn't emerge for poetry. It emerged for bookkeeping. The earliest scripts were pictographs of animals, grain, and goods, each representing what was received or owed. Symbols evolved as trade and taxation systems grew more complex. Barley was no longer just barley, it had to be shelled or unshelled, wet or dry, measured in sela, gore, or ban. Scribes developed abstract numerical systems and recorded them alongside transaction types. As one Assyriologist put it, the birth of writing was the birth of bureaucracy. The grain ration. In Babylonian temples and palaces, workers were often paid in kind, not with currency, but with food. The most common unit: barley. A male laborer might receive 1 sela, about a liter of barley per day. Occasionally a bit of oil. Very rarely beer. A woman might receive half that. Children even less. Each ration had to be tracked day by day, name by name, job by job. Miss a tablet, and a family could go hungry. Mark the wrong amount, and the city's food reserves could collapse. There was no digital backup. No reprint. Just clay. The clay file cabinet. When archaeologists uncovered the ancient city of Nippur, they found what amounts to a Bronze Age filing cabinet. Hundreds of clay tablets stacked neatly in niches along a wall. Each one bore information like 5 sheep to temple, barley assigned to Ahikar, month 7, loan of oil, repay in 12 days. Some were wrapped in clay envelopes, sealed with cylinder stamps. These functioned like notarized copies. You could break the outer layer to verify the contents inside. The bureaucracy was robust, organized, boring, but it worked. The scribe's day. A typical Babylonian scribe didn't spend his time crafting epics. That was rare. Most days involved receiving deliveries of grain or goods, recording temple expenses, issuing receipts, updating debt ledgers, auditing previous entries for errors. His tools were basic but standardized. His literacy gave him power. But his work was repetitive. He was a function, not a figurehead. And yet without him, the system stalled. Mistakes on clay. Contrary to popular belief, ancient scribes did make mistakes. Sometimes a symbol would be mispressed or a number miscounted. Scribes would correct them by scraping away the error if the clay was still wet, adding an annotation, or if baked, creating a new correction tablet. One such correction tablet reads, "Wrong count of goats, prior record off by 3, this one is true." It's both apologetic and practical. No drama, no reprimand. Just a correction. The power of small transactions. At first glance, a record of 4 baskets of dates or 2 missing sheep may seem unimportant. But zoom out across months, years, cities, and you begin to see trade routes, population movement, food security, religious funding, military provisioning. From 2 cups of grain came maps of trust. From a jar of oil, patterns of labor. What seemed boring became infrastructure. Yet amid the ledgers and rations, one wonders, did a scribe ever press his stylus into clay and sigh? Did he ever pause halfway through a tablet and ask, "Does this matter?" Did he ever imagine someone, 4,000 years later, would read his dull little list and listen? When you think of the fall of a city, you might picture enemy armies scaling walls, torches in hand, banners unfurling in blood-soaked wind. But sometimes, cities collapsed because someone didn't repay a jar of oil, or because a drought left barley stores too low to cover the worker rations, or because a single miscalculated debt spiraled through the temple system until priests could no longer balance their books. In Babylon, as in much of Mesopotamia, collapse didn't always come with a roar. Sometimes it came with a whisper pressed into clay. The ledger as law. Unlike modern ledgers kept behind bank doors or digital firewalls, Babylonian debt and credit records were often public. Clay tablets were stored in temples and palaces, often with duplicate copies kept by both lender and borrower. Everyone, scribes, traders, farmers, understood this structure. Goods could be borrowed. Repayment terms were specific. Defaulting had consequences. Tablets were often inscribed with details like 2 jars of sesame oil borrowed from Enlil's granary to be returned in month 4. Witness, Qudjur, son of Ibi. If the borrower failed to repay, the lender could bring the tablet to a court. In some cities, a priest would mediate the repayment. In others, the tablet itself became evidence, more reliable than memory. Debt as a cycle. It is estimated that the majority of lower-class Babylonians lived in a cycle of debt. A farmer borrows barley to plant his crop. The crop fails. He borrows again at higher interest. He offers his labor or his family's as payment. Eventually, he becomes bonded to the temple or palace system. This wasn't always slavery in the harshest sense, but it was binding. Tablets record entire families being handed over for a season in exchange for a debt of 5 gur, roughly 1,500 liters of grain. One document from Sippar reads, Marduk-Plaidna and his wife shall work for the house of Shamus for 3 months in payment of their grain loan, children exempt. These were not dramatic events. They were administrative. The difference between freedom and debt bondage was a few lines of cuneiform. Forgiveness by decree. Kings occasionally recognized the crushing weight of debt. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest known legal codes, included provisions for debt cancellation, especially during natural disasters. For example, if a storm destroyed a crop, the borrower was not responsible for that year's repayment. During a new king's coronation, it was customary to proclaim a clean slate, canceling many personal debts to symbolically reset society. This was not always altruism. A debt-ridden population couldn't fight in wars, build temples, or pay taxes. So occasionally, the clay was wiped clean. But only officially. Privately, debts remained. In many cases, The line between formal forgiveness and informal pressure blurred. Barley famine, one of the best documented economic disruptions in Babylonian history, occurred during a regional drought in the early 17th century BCE. Temple ledgers from Nippur, Larsa, and Ur show sudden drops in barley shipments, delays in worker payments, mass debt accumulation. A series of emergency tablets were drafted. No barley delivered from the south, stores closed, workers must wait. One particularly human note reads, 6 days without grain, women complain, the tablet has been shown, there is no more to say. The economy was not crashing in modern terms. But in terms of sustenance, the spreadsheet failed. And people went hungry. Scribal adjustments. During times of famine or conflict, scribes sometimes fudged the numbers. Clay doesn't erase easily, but clever notations did the trick. A borrowed quantity of 5 gur might be adjusted to 3.5 gur in the event of crop failure. A delayed payment might be footnoted. Returned though not timely. It's here that we see scribes not just as recorders, but as interpreters. They weren't simply writing reality. They were helping shape it. Through careful record-keeping and small narrative choices, they kept the economy and people's lives from unraveling entirely. The oil clerk's complaint. A fascinating letter from a clerk in a temple oil storehouse, dated roughly to 1750 BCE, offers a rare glimpse into bureaucratic burnout. The jars are counted, I have said this, they are whole, the measure is correct, yet I am asked again, I will not recount, my hands are blistered, my stylus is dull, I will sit in the shade. It's a minor complaint. Nothing dramatic. But it is real. A man tasked with repetitive counting, pushed to exhaustion by mistrust. A quiet voice from history saying, enough. When counting meant control. Beyond food and debt, record-keeping gave temples influence. By controlling the distribution of rations, the tracking of labor, the issuance of loans, temples became more than religious centers, they were economic hubs. And the scribes, they were the infrastructure. Some rose in power, managing vast networks of trade and storage. A few became stewards of royal estates. But most stayed anonymous. Their names, if preserved at all, appear only once or twice, like Tablet of Iluidia, son of Lamasi, oil account. And then silence. Still one must ask, did Iluidia know that his dull oil account would survive for 3,000 years? Did he suspect that future eyes would trace his wedge-shaped marks and try to understand his world through 2 cups of sesame oil? Somewhere around the 6th century BCE, long after the rise and fall of Hammurabi, after Assyria's roaring chariots had been replaced by quieter Persian governors, a lone clerk pressed his stylus into a damp clay tablet. His handwriting was neat but not ornate. He was recording a transfer of dates, an oil from one granary to another, perhaps between temples, perhaps from palace to priest. There was nothing remarkable about the tablet, until archaeologists found it, buried beneath layers of rubble, near what had once been the granary wall. It was the last receipt before the building burned. Babylon's quiet collapse. We often remember Babylon for its grandeur, its ziggurats, its legendary hanging gardens, its scholars and star watchers. But behind the mathematics and myth, Babylon was also a place of transactions. Every beam raised in a temple, every pot of beer brewed, every brick kiln fired was recorded. The records were not just tools, they were reality. So when empires shifted, when Babylonia became a satrapy under Persia, the first signs of collapse weren't wars or invasions. They were in the accounting. Tabulation slowed. Scribes reused older tablets. Rations shrank. The system that had once counted every sheep and barley silo began to drift. when the clay dried too fast. Clay tablets, while durable once fired, were fragile in their unfired state, and many day-to-day ledgers weren't baked, they were dried and stored in baskets. If humidity rose, they warped. If fire struck, they cracked. If misfiled, they were forgotten. And so, the impermanence of permanence defined much of Babylon's records. Only through repeated copying, sometimes across centuries, were certain ledgers preserved. One archive at Sippar includes a series of ration lists copied and recopied for 400 years. The final version includes this note: old list revised, first clay gone, names remain. The first clay was gone, but the names, the debts, the jars, the numbers they endured. The temple and the tablet. In Babylonian society, temples were the main hubs of both spiritual and economic life. Priests needed scribes as much as they needed gods, because gods, though divine, required offerings and offerings required tracking. One inventory of temple sacrifices includes a breakdown so precise it borders on obsessive. 3 white doves for Ishtar's courtyard. 2 jugs of strong wine year-aged for Marduk's altar. 12 reeds split and oiled for incense fire. Each item was recorded, then checked after the ritual. If anything was missing, it wasn't considered a theft, it was considered a cosmic imbalance. Accounting was sacred. Personal clay archives. Wealthier families sometimes kept their own small libraries of tablets, often detailing land agreements, dowries, and private debts. One recovered chest from the city of Kish contained a marriage contract, a record of inheritance, a dispute over water rights, a list of 3 unpaid rations. Each was stamped with seals from multiple witnesses. These weren't love letters. They weren't histories. They were life logistics. And for the family that owned them, they were likely more precious than any story or song. The dispute of the forgotten goat. A small but fascinating tablet from Ur, dated to around 1900 BCE, records a legal dispute. The goat was promised in repayment of the oil. The goat was then eaten. The oil remains unpaid. There's no indication of how the case ended, but the fact that this trivial event, one goat, required formal mediation suggests the stakes were larger than the animal. It was about trust. It was about record-keeping, and the right to say, this was written, therefore it is real. Lessons in the ledgers. Modern historians have pored over these dusty records not to track commodities, but to reconstruct an entire civilization. From them we know the approximate caloric intake of a laborer, the average lifespan of a draft ox, the rate of barley inflation during droughts, the scribal mistakes corrected over generations. We don't just learn about Babylonian economics, we learn about Babylonian values. Their society wasn't just defined by ziggurats or kings. It was defined by people who counted things, carefully, repetitively, quietly. Echoes on clay. There's something oddly intimate about reading a 4,000-year-old tablet that simply says, "Received 2 cups grain by Abisin." We don't know Abisin. We don't know why he received grain. But we know he did. We know someone thought it was worth writing down, worth confirming, worth preserving. There is something human in that. Not grand, not glorious, but deeply, quietly real. The clay that speaks. Today, many of those ancient receipts sit in drawers and museum basements. Scholars catalog them. Students read them. Most go unread. But every now and then, one is translated and reveals a forgotten woman's name, a long-repaid debt, a child's first recorded wage, a clerk's final signature. These aren't lost epics. They are accounting minutiae. And yet in their dullness lies something profound. A jar of oil. 2 cups of grain. The ledger of a world once counted, and now remembered. So perhaps the question isn't, why did they record all this? But rather, what small things do we write today that future historians might consider the backbone of our civilization?